So, let's begin, shall we? So, welcome to Mesh Sculpting for Realistic Terrain Features, or alternate title, What's New in World Building Unity 2019.3 edition. So we're going to be looking at some features from the beta as they relate to terrain. My name is Matt Schell. I'm an online evangelist here at Unity Technologies. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me during the Q&A. And if you're watching online, you can also hit me up on Twitter via @MattMirafish. I'm pretty much always on there. So I want to kind of introduce this term, world building in Unity, right? We're not talking about creating a fictional backstory for a world, although that's one way the term is used. What we're talking about here is creating content in Unity, right? So historically, Unity has been a tool where we would author content outside in a 3D package or in an audio generation tool, and then bring it all to life and give it interactivity in Unity, right? What we're starting to see now is more and more tooling that allows us to create content directly in the editor, right? So some of those tools we're going to look at today include the updates to the terrain system, ProBuilder, and also Polybrush. So the good news is that these tools are getting a lot better and more tightly integrated into Unity, and we're going to take a look at some of that. So just to have a kind of an example of the breadth of content that people are making in the Unity editor, we have on one hand an image from Manifold Garden, which you may or may not know. So Manifold Garden is an indie game which is made primarily by one person, William Cheer. He's got like a few other people helping him to finish, but it's basically one guy. Really gorgeous, interesting game, and it's actually modeled entirely in the Unity editor in ProBuilder. So he's been working on it for a while. He started before ProBuilder was part of Unity, but has basically made everything in there, and then with some nice shaders and post-processing kind of brought it to life, and it's well suited to this because it's this kind of geometric world. On another kind of extreme in terms of look, we have Book of the Dead, which is created by Unity's own demo team. And something that I was surprised to learn, I went up to Stockholm to visit them last year when they were finishing, and I was, surprised to learn that they were actually building a lot of this on top of the built-in Unity terrain, right? So the ground, the grass, and then obviously there are these kind of beautiful photogrammetry assets and great shaders and post-processing to bring it to life. But the actual kind of bedrock of it is the built-in Unity terrain system. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So this gives you a kind of an idea of the different types of things that are possible with some of these content creation tools within Unity. So what's in this 25-minute talk? It's actually a 20-minute talk, so that's wrong. But the first thing we're going to talk about is terrain holes. So this is something that if you've been using terrain in Unity, many of us have been waiting for a long time, and is now available in the beta of 2019.3. And you can grab it and try it out now. We're also going to look at using ProBuilder and Polybrush in combination with holes to create a kind of, in this case, it's like a sewer thing, but basically to create caves and to create level features that go through the terrain and below the landscape, which is something that people have wanted to do for a while. We're going to talk a little bit about the terrain toolbox, which was released last year, but is seeing some updates in 2019.2 and makes authoring terrain a lot easier, particularly for larger terrains. Within terrain toolbox, we're going to look at the new terrain brushes with the brush mask filters, which are pretty interesting, and also some of the erosion tools. So, eye warning, right? Programmer art ahead, there be dragons. I'm not a 3D artist, I'm not an environment artist, so please don't judge me. I'm just a humble online evangelist. So, terrain holes. So, what we have here is basically the ability to punch holes in the terrain mesh, right? So this is still a height map based system, right? We're starting with basically a flat plane using a height map to offset along the y-axis, right? And make hills and canyons. And now we can make holes in that. Now, it's important to note that this is not on its own something that you can use to make tunnels, overhangs, freestanding bridges, cave systems. It's just offsetting the height and then the ability to punch a hole in the terrain. Now, what we are going to show is how we can use some of the other tools together to kind of bridge that gap and to make some of those types of features. And it works seamlessly with the existing Unity systems like physics, nav mesh, and light mapping. And there is an API so that you can do this from code. So here's an example, right? This is an example of some of my beautiful programmer art. Basically, what you see on this is your left side of the screen. What you see on the left side of the screen is I've made a little terrain, and I've punched a hole through it using the hole painting brush, which is basically what it is. It's authored in a very similar way that you would author elevation or textures. You can just basically paint a hole into the terrain mesh. And then what I've done is built a gorgeous tube and stairs, which is going to take us down below the terrain mesh, where we can then continue with whatever geometry we want. And I have a little animated GIF of this, right? We're going down. At this point, we're now below the terrain, and then we can continue with whatever we want, right? So the other thing the first two shapes you saw there are generated with ProBuilder, right? That's just a tube primitive. There's a stairs primitive, which are just some of the primitive shapes that you can create in ProBuilder. What I've done here is created an arch, which is another type of primitive shape, and placed it in front of my tube, and then making sure, so on the right side, you can see also gorgeous programmer art, right? You can see that I'm offsetting the vertices to create this more irregular shape using Polybrush, right? So when I'm generating the raw geometry in ProBuilder, I want to make sure that I have enough vertices to be able to edit those vertices in Polybrush and kind of make some more irregular shapes. And I have a little time lapse of myself doing that here. So you can see, right, we start with just a basic arch primitive. Now, what you can see here with the yellow selections, and it'll loop back around, is that you can continue to edit the geometry in the same way that you would edit ProBuilder geometry, even after you've kind of mangled it with Polybrush. Or, if you're a good artist, mangled might not be the word, but in this case, I think it's appropriate. So here, I'm shrinking the entryway, right, just using the face selection tool in ProBuilder. And for someone like me who's not a 3D artist, this is a really useful tool set just for blocking out levels, getting a feeling for an environment, and it's something that you can iterate on really, really quickly, right? You can just quickly grab and edit the faces and make an environment that has the feeling that you want. The next step here is smoothing out the edges, right? Using the smooth tool in Polybrush, I took some of those super jagged edges and smoothed them down. And then because I decided, actually, you know what, I don't want this to be an arch. I want it to try to connect back to the hillside here. Again, I'm just selecting the faces and pulling them back out to make that connection. So just another example of how we're not, this is not a one-way workflow, right? You can start in ProBuilder, edit a little bit in Polybrush, go back to kind of editing faces in ProBuilder, and it's just a really quick and fluid approach right in the Unity editor. So shifting to the terrain toolbox. So the terrain toolbox is a new set of tooling that allows for the automation of larger terrains, right? So what we can do is, and I have a shot of the window on the next slide. Basically what you can see here is we have this mountain. This is actually composed of multiple different terrain tiles, and you can see that the height map is blending smoothly across multiple tiles, right? You can see one of the tiles selected there in orange. And so we can create multiple terrain tiles simultaneously and then import height maps which transition smoothly across them. So here's an example of the window, right? We can set the width, length, and height of the terrain. We can import a height map or multiple height maps, save presets, and so on. And this is available as of 2018.3 and just saw some updates in 2019.2. that I'm going to talk about. So we've seen some improvements also to the brush UX. One of the things that's just a kind of a quality of life thing, but that's really nice, is that we have per brush common settings, so that when you change brushes, you don't have to reset the settings for each brush. Those will persist as you change tools. One of the things that I really enjoy is the jitter, scatter, and spacing parameters. So basically, one of the things that you may see if you try to kind of author terrain is that as you're painting, it can look very kind of fake and man-made if you have these sort of clear brush strokes and very sharp transitions, right? Using some of these tools, you can add a little bit of kind of procedural randomness or procedural noise as you're painting, which gives things a kind of a more organic and sort of naturalistic feeling. So this all is supported, has its own hotkeys, which are really handy to use. A controls brush strength, which is basically the opacity painting onto the height map. S controls the brush size. D controls rotation. You can invert the brush, so let's say you're painting height. If you hold down control, you can sync the terrain. Shift enables smoothing, and Shift plus A enables the terrain layer eyedropper tool, where basically, so you don't have to go back to your palette, you can just click on the terrain to select the terrain layer that you want to paint. And this is also customizable via the shortcut manager shown on the slide. So one of the new things that is cool that was added in 2019.2 are these brush mask filters. So these are pretty new. Basically, what they allow you to do is to add additional operations to the brush before outputting to the height map, right? So what we can see here is we're using one of the math operations, which is an add operation, which is basically increasing the brightness of the pixels that we're painting to the height map, right? So we're having a much stronger effect. And there's a whole list of additional math operations that you can do. So in addition, we have the terrain brush mask filters, which will actually take into account the existing state of the terrain. So for example, let's say we want to paint, in the case of height, right, we want to paint snow only on things above a certain elevation in our terrain, right? We can mask, we can set a parameter that says only allow us to paint within this height range. In this case, the height range is a float between 0 and 1, which is the total height of the terrain, right? So we can say within this band of terrain, we're going to allow, for example, painting of snow, right? And this is applicable to all of the brushes. And we can also do this for the slope aspect, concaveness, or the slope, and they're applied in top to bottom order, and you can, effectively mute or disable them at will as you're painting, turn them on and off, and continue painting, right? So it's a nice workflow that allows you to kind of paint a little bit intelligently onto the terrain and mask off things that, for example, you might not want to paint over, or save you some time of kind of trying to be super precise about painting only at a certain elevation by hand, for example. So we've also added, these were added in 2018.3 with the original terrain toolbox, but we have a bunch of new brush types, right? In addition to the new brush settings, we have a clone brush, which operates similarly to the Photoshop clone tool, if you've ever used that, for cloning textures from one part of the terrain to the other. We have height stamp and mesh stamp, which allows us to stamp a brush into the terrain. Bridge is kind of interesting. It allows you to control, click, and have a continuous line of elevation drawn between two places. Let's say you want to make a definitely traversable path for the player, right? You can bridge between, let's say, two mountains or whatever. Importantly, it's not a freestanding bridge, right? It's just going to be a raised kind of line of terrain. Pinch, bulge, twist, and smudge are basically image editing tools, but that can be applied to the height map and allow you to kind of distort the data in the height map. Procedural noise is another one of these procedural tools that allows us to generate noise in the terrain, again, to kind of add this randomness and a little bit of a more sort of naturalistic feeling. Terrace allows you to create stepped hills, kind of like rice paddies you might see in Asia, which is pretty fun, and also is a nice way to generate areas that are definitely walkable, right, because they're flat. And then we have slope, flatten, sharpen peaks, and contrast. Sharpen peaks and contrast, which will allow you to modify the existing painted height map data. I think I'm going too fast. I'm going to be done too early. So we've also added, and this was added in 18.3, these physical erosion brushes. So what these are designed to do is to emulate some of the kind of detailed natural effects that you would have from geologic or weathering processes, right? So that you can paint, as you can see here, right, we have these kind of rough shapes, right? It's just kind of a blob of raised terrain. And then you can paint in with, for example, the thermal erosion brush on the left and create these kind of cracked landscapes, which would take you quite a lot of time to paint or draw in by hand. And then we also have hydraulic erosion, which models, flow patterns of water eroding the terrain, or wind erosion, right, which gives us this kind of more smoothed erosion patterns. And I think this is a direction that you're going to see Unity continue, and also is something that we're broadly seeing across the industry, right, is this move towards, as people are called upon to generate larger and larger environments, right, and often not with larger and larger teams, right, we're seeing a shift towards these kind of procedural tools, where as opposed to drawing or painting everything by hand, we're starting to see not pure procedural content generation from scratch, although obviously that's an interesting area as well, but these kind of procedural artist tools where an artist can kind of take a simulation brush like this and paint into an environment and generate content that way. So yeah, that is my talk for today. We have, there's a GitHub repo that's available that contains the terrain tool samples. There's also a forum thread if you'd like to talk to the devs and give them some feedback. And then if you're listening online and you have a question, feel free to hit me up on Twitter via @MattMirafish. And with that, I will open this up for questions. Thank you. I sped through. I think I have like a lot of extra time, actually, so I'm at your mercy. Anybody? Yeah. So the question is anything planned for overhangs? So as far as I know, the solution for now is that you will, for non-height map-based data, you'll replace with a mesh. So it's not going to turn into a voxel-based solution or anything like that. I mean, obviously, you can. The point now is that you can integrate those kind of things in a relatively seamless way, and I know that they're aware of that as a need and working to make that a better process. But I don't think in this editing environment, no. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is about, with the example of the erosion brushes, using that simulation data to paint textures. The short answer is I don't know. I would guess that with that being a direction that's being actively explored, I would guess that we may very well see something like that in the future. But the short answer is I don't know. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. So the question is, can we get the raw output from this data, the raw output from the brushes in order to generate your own, for example, texture data? So it's outputting basically black and white pixel data, right? It's outputting a height map. So if you want to take that and do something creative with it, you can. I think that's the basic. I mean, the data is just, it's basically writing to a black and white texture. So yeah. I mean, that's the answer I can give right now. Yeah. Anybody else? All right, well, thanks so much for coming.